NAHB Chief Economist Dr. Robert Dietz returns to the Construction Lending Podcast with a critical mid-year update. Remodeling is booming, now making up nearly half of all construction activity, driven by tight inventory, rising home equity, and an aging housing stock. Dietz explores the $35 trillion in home equity and rate lock-in effects driving this boom, while revealing new state-level data to help lenders pinpoint renovation demand.
The lack of existing home sales, the lack of turnover in the existing stock means there's this growing demand to reinvest in existing homes. Some of the fastest growing remodeling markets right now are in places like Ohio and Michigan because of that aging housing stock. If we want to fix the housing affordability crisis that's really become apparent in the post-COVID era, it's going to have to occur at the state and local level in terms of those policy changes.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the Construction Lending Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Ferris with Land Gorilla, and today, back on the podcast, we have Dr. Robert Dietz, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the National Association of Home Builders. You're a two-time guest now. Welcome to the podcast again.
Yeah, great to join you. I have a mid-year update. So yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, last time we really talked a lot about, kind of state of the union, mainly probably anchored in new construction more than anything. Maybe we start this off with a little bit about renovation and what's going on, what you're seeing out in the markets.
Yeah, with 2026 looking a lot like 2025 for things like single-family home building, there's been a lot of emphasis on remodeling, repair, improvement spending. And if you kind of think about the post-COVID era, there's certain facts we know. Inventory remains tight. Regulatory costs have been an impact. But I think the big thing on the demand side is people are moving with less frequency. And that's all due to consequences connected to the housing market. But that fact that people are staying in their homes longer and home prices have continued to go up means that there's a lot more demand for remodeling activity. So we survey remodelers, their views of the market have remained positive during the entire post-COVID period. That's in real contrast to apartment builders and single-family builders that have had periods of negativity about market conditions. So we continue to see the remodeling market as particularly solid right now. There's some geographic elements, some reasons about the aging housing stock, but it's been interesting to look at that growing share of remodeling activity in terms of overall residential construction.
So remodeling's not going anywhere. I'm definitely feeling that in my neighborhood.
Yeah, and so I'll just as an example of that, in 2007, in terms of overall residential construction activity, roughly a third of it was remodeling. Today, it's up to 45%, and we have in our 10-year forecast a 30% growth rate for the remodeling market, which would take that particular sector above 50% of residential construction activity. So in the coming years, more than half of actual residential construction activity is going to be connected to the remodeling market. And, the primary drivers, you've got more than $35 trillion of home equity owned by homeowners. That's a lot of kind of raw fuel to drive that housing demand. But the big thing is the demographics of the housing stock itself. We all know the housing stock's too small, connected to issues around land development and the challenges for builders. But the housing stock itself is aging as well. The typical age of an owner-occupied home right now is above 40 years old. And it's particularly old in segments of the Midwest and the Northeast. So a combination of an aging housing stock with homeowners having access to equity means there's a lot of demand for remodeling. And by the way, it's not just connected to improvement spending. There's a kind of a traditional home building construction connection as well. There's a growing share of teardown construction taking place across the country. Right now, we estimate about 7% of single-family housing starts are teardown starts, and that share is going to go above 10% in the coming years.
Wow. One thing I didn't hear you say, and maybe it's just implied, but, I think about, my situation and, multiply it times the rest of the nation. But we're kind of locked in place. We can't give up our interest rate. Housing prices have gone up so much for the same house that we want. We got to double in payment for the one that is a little bit nicer than what we currently have. It's really getting up there. Is that kind of the mindset of everybody, like, we're really not going to be able to upgrade, so let's just put the money into what we have.
Yeah, I hear this from remodelers all the time, which is you can't buy a house, but you can modify your existing house that you're kind of locked into because of the mortgage rate lock-in effect. And actually, this actually runs counter to the traditional forecasting models that would suggest that when there's a little bit of a decline in existing home sales, that tends to hurt the remodeling market. Is actually the opposite right now. The lack of existing home sales, the lack of turnover in the existing stock means there's this growing demand to reinvest in existing homes. You think about the traditional triggers, right? The kids move out, or you've got a younger household that moved into a home and they really reach to get in that home, but it's a fixer-upper. It's that kind of activity. And when we survey remodelers across the country, they just have a lot of backlog in terms of work to be done. So it's a growing sector. It has some of the same challenges that we hear from home builders and apartment builders in terms of access to skilled labor, some of the regulatory concerns. And in some ways, remodelers are even more subject to the risk around building materials because a traditional home builder would be reaching out to a building material supply company. A remodeler is more likely to go to a big box store to go buy building materials. So the ups and downs in pricing of individual materials are going to affect a remodeler much more closely. And then from an industry perspective and an investor perspective, the remodeling sector is amazingly decentralized. I think there's something like 50,000 home building companies in the US. And of course, the top 10 builders represent about a third of overall construction. So it's fairly concentrated there on the single family side. But in the remodeling sector, there's more than 120,000 individual remodeling companies. That doesn't include one-off contractors. So, 120,000 firms, and it is very decentralized. So one of the conversations we've seen from the investment community is thinking about mergers and acquisitions, disruption in the industry, AI, and how it can help the industry more to become more efficient. There's just a lot of change that's coming. So I think the remodeling sector over the next decade is going to produce a lot of change for the housing stock, and we're going to see a lot of change on the industrial side.
Any particular trends that we should be seeing in remodeling? We're talking about it as a broad category, but are there certain things out there that tend to be more popular right now when it comes to remodeling?
In any given year, typically about 50% of remodeling is connected to traditional kitchen and bathroom remodels, and that continues to be the mainstay. But the thing that we've seen a growing share of in the post-COVID environment is whole house remodeling and additions. And it gets right back to the point you were making, which is with a lot of people kind of locked in a place, they're looking to expand their home. They're looking to buy a larger home, but they don't want to give up that existing low rate mortgage. But what can they do? They can make an addition onto an existing home where zoning permits it. So we've seen growth, particularly in the 2022 to 2025 period, of big project remodeling. In our consumer surveys, we see growth and interest in things like making older homes, and here we're talking about homes 60, 70, 80, 100 years old, make those homes more resilient, more energy efficient. So for remodelers looking to work with aging in place remodeling, for example, I think there's kind of the stereotype that baby boomers and other retirees, they're all going to move to Phoenix or the villages in Florida, and that's not really the case. There's a huge number of people who age in place. And that's been a particularly hot part of the improvement sector, which is making those aging in place improvements. Some of that includes energy efficiency, trying to reduce the utility bills in retirement years. But some of it is just kind of basic fix-up items, things like adding railings, improving lighting, the traditional kind of what we call the aging in place improvement set of investments that are made into an existing home. So additions, aging people, aging housing stock, making homes more resilient. We see all of that as a growth area going forward, and it has been over the last few years.
You mentioned, full teardowns and rebuilds. How much of that is like due to like upzoning or increasing density versus, hey, we're looking to build our dream home and we can't find an empty lot, so we're just going to tear this one down?
It's helping at the margin, and I would add into that list of policy environments that you cite things like subdivision by right, where you can take an existing lot and divide it into two homes. You might then knock down some older home that was built in the 30s and 40s and build two newer homes on that previous lot. But really, I think the bulk of tear down construction is a one for one replacement. So it makes that existing site possess a home that is more energy efficient, more resilient. It doesn't necessarily add to the housing stock. So tear down construction is kind of one of these interesting patterns we see in the housing market. And you can see the examples of it. Go outside Boston, go into New Jersey, outside New York, or outside Washington, D.C. And where I live in Northern Virginia, home building within the beltway of the Washington, D.C. area pretty much is tear down construction. And by the way, it's not just residential to residential. One of the trends that we've seen is replacement of commercial real estate with residential real estate. The most efficient and the best examples I've seen of that over the last couple of years are old shopping malls that can be replaced with walkable urban villages. So you take that old shopping mall, you knock it down, you build townhouses, low-rise multifamily, and where the mall itself used to be, you've got your grocery store and your library, your theater, your bars, your 15-minute neighborhood. And that is a growing item. Now, it requires, again, as you indicated, it requires some zoning help in terms of to make those kinds of improvements. And there's sometimes resistance to, adding non-single family detached housing. But in a market where those younger home buyers are looking for any kind of home to get into, whether it's a fixer-upper that they're going to have to remodel or new stock, that's one way of doing it.
You mentioned, kind of zoning, and this is kind of where we've seen like a lot of change happening, whether it's bills being passed on a federal level or state level. Seems to be a lot of activity, that's focused on providing more housing or, deregulation of, zoning and housing constraints. What are you seeing in that arena? Are there some big bills that we need to look out for that are going to be really impactful? Are there, a lot of positive changes that you're seeing? Any movement? Give us a little
Well,
bit of.
at the federal level, we're recording this on July 8th. The housing bill that moved through the Senate and the House is now pending. It's sitting on the president's desk. It will automatically go into law on Friday of this week. It's not clear yet whether the president's going to attach his signature to it, whether he's just going to let it go into law. He did call the bill a big yawn, so I'm not sure he's particularly eager to get engaged in it. He could also veto it and then round up some senators and try to block an override. I think the betting money is that bill is going to go into law, and it includes some provisions. It includes a lot of things, including some support for attainable housing supply and some changes to manufactured housing in terms of what we used to call mobile homes. But it also includes some incentives in terms of grant programs for the federal government to incentivize state and local governments to make those zoning changes. And the reason I started with the federal and kind of led to the state and local is ultimately the improvements on the land development side, tear down construction, even in remodeling. We can talk about the connection of zoning and remodeling in a second. Those changes are going to have to be made at the state and local level. And what our state and local associations report and our lobbyists working at NAHB is that there's just a growing consensus among policymakers that ultimately, if we want to fix the housing affordability crisis that's really become apparent in the post-COVID era, it's going to have to occur at the state and local level in terms of those policy changes. And I'll tell you, when I was traveling the country 15 years ago, and we sort of warned that this was going to happen because it had gotten so difficult to build housing, particularly entry-level housing in markets like California and the coastal markets on the East Coast.
Dequa.
Yeah, the price to income ratio was going to go crazy. And in fact, that's happened, right? Historically, the price to income ratio was 3-to-1. Today, it is 5-to-1. There are huge numbers of Americans living in homes that if they were forced to buy today, they could not afford to actually purchase it. They're lucky they got into it. So the changes are going to occur at those state and local levels. There appears to be a bipartisan consensus, at least among housing analysts and economists, the left and the right, that zoning is one of those areas we can do it. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to live in a high-rise apartment. I think that was sort of the discussion 10, 15 years ago, the sort of superstar cities and the idea that everyone's going to kind of live in these super
Urban,
dense
yeah.
metropolitan areas. That was never going to happen. We didn't see that in the survey data. But medium density, walkable density, light touch density, the walkable neighborhoods, which includes things like townhouse construction, and as we were just talking about, adding in additional housing with some by right zoning changes, that can happen. And I mentioned that there's a zoning connection to remodeling. Often people think, oh, zoning is really about new development and land development issues and things like that. But part of the challenges with an aging housing stock is we need to make those investments into existing homes. Well, setback requirements, which is how far the home has to be from its nearest housing unit or from the sidewalk or from the street. Setback requirements are often necessary to be fulfilled to get a permit to do remodeling. What we found is that a lot of older housing stock doesn't meet setback requirements. It was built and it predates, right?
Yeah, predates.
When you go to pull a remodeling permit to do some kind of substantial work, often you will find, not often, but it happens, you'll find that no, you can't do that kind of construction because it doesn't meet the setback requirement. It's not far enough away. I actually happen to live in a townhouse neighborhood in Northern Virginia where they had to change the zoning laws to allow certain kinds of improvement projects to take place because the setback requirement was X number of feet. Well, my nearest neighbor is 0 feet away because I'm in a townhouse, and they hadn't changed the law. So there are all kinds of implications, not just for new construction, but for existing changes as well. But I think, again, we're going to see a lot of investment in this area.
What do you think the future looks like for remodeling in general? What are we
Yeah.
up against?
We're real bullish. So, if you lined up a bunch of housing analysts, you'd have the usual distribution of some middle takes, we don't see that much growth. We're definitely an outlier right now. And I think we're in the right place in terms of forecasting. Over the next decade, we think the overall remodeling market's going to grow by about 30%. And in fact, what we've been advising builders is, if you think about over the next decade, you probably want to have a remodeling side business to kind of hedge business conditions. And the reason for that growth is that household formations are going to slow. I think we talked about that in January. That's going to have an impact in terms of the volume of single family construction as we move into the mid 2030s. But that aging housing stock, people investing in the existing stock itself, that's going to be a growth segment. So, and I believe I mentioned it earlier, we think sometime in the next 5 to 7 years, remodeling is going to be more than 50% of overall residential construction activity. So we've come a really bullish view. And the data that we continue to take from the industry indicates that, yes, the market's slowed down a little bit. The overall housing market has slowed here in 2025 and 2026, but remodeling itself continues to grow. In fact, on a cash flow basis, the remodeling market right now is 8% bigger than it was just a year ago. So
Wow.
we're going to continue to see growth.
Now, our audience is a bunch of construction lenders, right?
Yeah.
We kind of live in our own little universe over here, but we're very much attuned to what's happening in real estate sales and as it pertains to their markets. What kind of advice would you give to mortgage lenders in general, about renovation products? A mortgage maybe that includes some sort of renovation component into that. Is that something they need to be paying attention to right now because the future looks bright, or how much of an impact is that going to be?
I think that's right. So whether it's an acquisition that includes a kind of a rehab element or an improvement spending program, I think looking at that kind of tear down construction angle, those kinds of non-traditional home transactions, I think is going to be a rising share. And I think this is the key part. It's geographic in terms of the intensity. So if you're a lender and most of your work takes place in the South or the Southeast, there's not going to be a lot of change. In fact, right now, more than half of single family home building occurs in the South. If you're in the Northeast, if you're in the Midwest, places with somewhat wealthier households, older households and an older housing stock. In fact, some of the fastest growing remodeling markets right now are in places like Ohio and Michigan because of that aging housing stock. You want to be looking into that because that is a place where we can get some market expansion and might be outside of the traditional role that you played in the marketplace.
What are the hottest areas right now where you see remodeling?
Yeah, it's a lot of the Northeast. So if you think about what's been powering the market, aging housing stock and household net worth. Now, driven by gains in home prices, but really driven by gains in that net worth element. So as the stock market has gone up over the last 2, 3, 4 years, you're thinking about markets like Connecticut, markets like New Jersey, and then the Midwest. The Midwest has been kind of an interesting area for 2025 and 2026. It's seen gains in single family home construction, where the rest of the country has seen retreats. And it's also seen gains in remodeling. And again, it's that intersection of an aging housing stock combined with people that have net worth that they're willing to invest in those homes. And sometimes that takes the form of a HELOC loan. Sometimes it takes the form of a cash purchase to a remodeler. In fact, remodelers tell us in our surveys, anytime they see an uptick in mortgage interest rates, the traditional client that they're working with moves quickly over to cash. So if you expect mortgage interest rates to head closer down to 6%, and we do over the next 2 to 3 years, what we would expect is a small uptick in HELOC type lending for those remodelers. And yeah, we know HELOC lending is connected to the Federal Reserve's actions and the prime rate itself. But as we eventually get some declines in those rates, we're going to see some demand for home purchases. We're going to see an increase in demand for construction and an increase in demand for improvement related spending.
So I get it. Remodeling is looking strong, for the future. What are some of the things that could take the wind out of the sails when it comes to remodeling? What should we be paying attention to and saying, hey, if this changes a little bit over here or this we get movement over here, maybe that could slow it down?
I think the number one potential risk for the remodeling market is the skilled labor shortage. We've talked about this a lot in terms of the construction industry. It's a limiting factor on how many homes can be built, how many apartments can be developed. For land developers, access to labor matters in terms of extending how long it takes to develop a site. But remodelers always kind of point out to me, it's one thing to try to recruit workers to go work on a kind of a construction site, but I've got to be doubly conscious of who I hire because I'm working in someone's existing home already. So it's not just a matter of filling the headcount. I've actually got to be a little bit more particular in terms of who I'm working with. And I think that's the legit point. So remodelers are kind of uniquely at risk to the skilled labor shortage because of that factor. And then they're often last in line for workers. The residential construction sector often loses workers to non-residential construction. And as we've seen an uptick in data center investment in AI, there's growth in hiring non-residential construction, and the residential construction sector is losing out. But remodelers, being smaller businesses, then are last in line even within the residential construction sector. So some of the issues that we've been talking about in 2025 and 2026 in terms of immigration enforcement, the availability of construction workers, all those factors are uniquely risk elements for the remodeling sector, which is why we've made the argument that remodelers really need to get involved nationwide in their local builders associations, building industry associations, because the hard work of developing that next generation of construction workers is being done there in terms of working with high schools and trade schools and community colleges. The other element that I would put as a potential risk factor is some of the regulatory burdens. We mentioned some of the zoning rules. Any of those items that just increases the cost of construction. Remodelers are small, and so small increases in construction costs can often determine whether or not a project moves forward. So the regulatory environment, I think, remains a risk factor as well.
No, that's good to know. So as we, start to look into the future, we can see how strong everything is. We can see our threats on the horizon, but we really can't have a talk about the future without talking about AI. How is AI impacting the remodeling industry, if it is at all?
Yeah, right now the surveys that we do with builders and contractors indicate that something like a third of residential construction firms are using AI. The primary purpose they're using them for are research, some marketing purposes, generate marketing materials. I think the actual implementation of using AI as a strategic tool, whether it's identifying, lot sites or improving processes or speeding up the organizational process. That's still really in its infancy. Now, there are consultants and others who are working on how to utilize the data that firms have to try to improve things, to get the large language models trained up. And I think that's going to happen over the next few years. But right now, it's really limited. That's the direct effect. From my sort of economist perch, I'm looking also at the indirect effect, which is what AI is going to do to the overall economy. And the view that I've taken is there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of concerns, there's a lot of overstatement about AI. I tend to be kind of in the boring middle on this one. I'm not a subscriber of this idea of the AI jobs apocalypse that's going to have a huge impact on housing demand. If you remember this past spring, there was a memo that was circulating around Wall Street about how the mortgage market was going to collapse and the job market was going to collapse because we were going to have 50 or 80% unemployment. That's not going to happen. There's no history in economic history of a positive productivity shock, which is what AI is, producing huge levels of structural unemployment. AI is a tool. And here's the good news. AI, which is a little exaggerated, but it's getting better, is going to make workers more productive. And anytime an economy gets a productivity shock, incomes go up. And we talked earlier about the price to income ratio being 5 to 1. We need that price to income ratio getting closer back to the historic norm of 3 to 1. Well, there's two ways to do it. One, prices to go down. We don't want that. That would have big negative impacts for homeowners. It would have an impact for the remodeling market. But the other way for that price to income ratio to get back to closer to 3 to 1 is rising income growth. And this is where my boring, optimistic take comes into play. I think over the next decade, we're going to see above trend growth rates in incomes. And that's going to help the housing market, whether it's purchasing land, purchasing new single family construction, or investing in remodeling projects.
Are you contributing that to productivity? The output of the individual is going to be 20x, therefore their wages and value to a company goes up.
Yeah, the productivity growth story that we're going to see take place in the U.S. is the primary driver of the economic narrative. In fact, I saw one economist recently say that there are only really two questions that matter for the U.S. economy. How many kids are we having, and what's productivity growth going to be for the next decade? Everything else is just commentary and flavor. I think that's right. And so, yeah, I think productivity growth is going to be faster. And by the way, within construction, productivity growth has been one of our challenges. If you look since the early 90s, the average worker in the US economy, so for the overall economy, the average worker is about 50% more productive than they were in the early 90s. They can just do more, they're producing more in terms of goods and services. 50%. For construction, it's only 19%. That is an enormous differential. And there's been academic studies, consulting studies, and what they find is that construction is slow to change, partly because it's decentralized. I would also argue that the regulatory burden deters change. We've looked at this, by the way. A decade ago, something like 70% of workers in the construction industry were tradesmen, basically people swinging hammers. Today, it's 60%. We've gone from 70 to 60. Why? We have more paper pushers. We have more red tape. It's just harder to innovate. And when you've got more people not doing construction, productivity is going to suffer. So the industry is ripe for change. I think there's a lot of opportunities for people to deploy AI models to make construction firms more productive. And then, as I said, with the overall broader economics of this, income growth should be faster than inflation growth. Federal policy can screw that up. We could talk about that in terms of Social Security and Medicare and tax policy. But if we get above trend income growth, that is a bullish signal for the overall residential construction industry over the next decade.
I love this conversation as we kind of start to get out the crystal ball. And I think the one thing that just, leaves me scratching my head is where do all these robots, start to fit in? And I love listening to Elon Musk and his
Yeah.
vision of the future. And, the guy's like batting near 1,000. So
Oh, yeah.
you got to give him some credit.
Yeah.
And you start hearing about the numbers. He's talking about billions of robots. And I'm like, whoa, that's a lot. That's a lot. You know, especially with construction, what he has plans
Yeah.
for, moon bases and Mars, and you know, will we really see robots in construction, and how much of an impact can that make on the
We
industry?
will, but it's going to be slower than expected. One of my favorite videos of the last decade is a brick lane robot, and to see how it operates. But then you learn the conditions in which it has to operate, which is a virtually
Perfect.
flat. Yeah, perfect, right? Nothing can go wrong. So I think it's going to come into place. And it is kind of interesting right now that the two broader discussions about the fact that we're not having enough kids, but we're also worried about this jobs apocalypse that's coming because of AI. These things might be complements, right? Right. The fact that the actual head count of the population, in fact, one of the sort of the great ironies is for the last 30 years, we've been talking about overpopulation. The challenge of the 21st century is not overpopulation, it's
No.
declining population. And all of a sudden, just at the same moment, we're talking about robots. So I think robotics within construction is coming. It does require some of those near perfect conditions, so it's going to be slow to come. We are going to see more off-site construction. Right now, if you look at modular and panelized construction, and again, this also has an improvement or a tear down construction angle, but it's about 2 to 3% of single family home building. In the late 90s, that particular subsector was like 7 to 8%. So we absolutely believe offsite construction trends are going to increase. I think they'll get to 10 or 15% in the coming decade. That's one way that we can increase productivity. Robots are going to be part of that story because manufacturers have a skilled labor shortage, just like the construction industry. But it's a huge amount of investment. It's going to require learning. And this gets back to my sort of boring, you know, optimistic take. It's going to create new jobs along the way. I mean, when was the last time you met somebody who was in the whale oil business, right? Jobs come and go. If you go back and you look at the 1860s, something like 65% of the American population was in agriculture. Today, it's 1%. So markets are great at redeploying slack resources. And if you get productivity growth that's generating that, that's just a net positive for the overall industry. So, yeah, I think robots are going to come to some of the work sites, but they're going to be specialized. It's like anything else, trial and error, learning by doing, which means a lot of jobs, a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities coming in the sector. And whether it's new construction or rehabbing the old housing stock, there's a lot of work to be done over the next 10 to 20 years.
No, that's it. We could probably talk about this all day, but one of the things that I'm kind of interested in hearing is I've seen a lot of the emails from the NAHB about the state level remodeling estimate. Give me your take on that and tell me what I'm missing out on right now.
Yeah, one of the kind of the interesting things is, as I said, the remark is about 45% of the residential construction industry. There's not a lot of great data. I mean, if you get a group of housing economists together, they can talk about home prices, they can talk about home sales, construction stats, but the remodeling market, we don't have a lot of data. And that's partly due to the fact that the remodeling industry is so decentralized. There's not a lot of, or any really, in terms of big publicly traded national firms. So my team is now put out for the first time, we're going to be updating this quarterly, some state level estimates of remodeling spend. There are national numbers. There are a variety of different sources. They don't necessarily agree, but we've come up with a model to take some internal data, match it with some census data, and then look at the individual growth rates state by state of the remodeling sector. And as I said earlier, the kind of the initial run indicated that some of the fastest growing remodeling markets right now are in the Midwest. Ohio and Michigan are good examples. So aging housing stock, the stock market has helped. We're going to continue to update that quarter by quarter, and it will be basically a heat map for where we see growth in this expanding part of the residential construction sector.
Tell me you guys are going to keep expanding on that as well as far as the information, because there's I think, an amazing amount of demand, especially for our listeners in, hey, what's trending? What's hot? Where is it hot? How much is it growing? How much is it shrinking? And even getting into the weeds of, not just the remodeling dollar, but what is the dollar being applied to?
That's
Is it
right. And
going into a pool, an ADU, what?
that's right. We want to get into and get the same level of detail. It's going to take some time, but the same level of detail that we have with single family home building, types of projects, financing, who's building what in terms of the individual firms. And by the way, as a reflection of that, if you look at NAHB's leadership right now, we have 5 elected builders who act as our senior officer team. Right now, 2 of those 5 have a background in remodelers. As remodelers. So that is an indication of how the industry is involved. That's absolutely big. So, in fact, our current chairman was a remodeler from Ohio, and I started talking to him 3 or 4 years ago and said, when you're leading NAHB, what do you want to see? And he said, more research in the remodeling sector. So we challenged our economics team. We've got 12 great economists, and we're going to be increasing our surveys, our data products, and this SPR project, we initially called it the SPQR project, which the quarterly remodeling, we had to get rid of that. It was too close to the Roman Empire there. But SPR, state level projections and remodeling, is going to be our quarterly product and flagship indicator that will be the counterpart to like the housing starts report that we get for single family and multifamily construction.
Oh, no, that's awesome. I can't wait to get my hands on that. That is definitely overdue.
That's right.
Definitely overdue. Well, what kind of last words would you have for our listeners? We talked about the current state. We talked about the future state. We even talked about robots here. We're missing today.
Yeah, the big take on the economy this year, 2026 feels an awful like 2025. We're looking at 2027 as kind of a little more stabilization year. But the big thing that we've learned over the last 2 years is in the Trump 2.0 era, it's really hard to forecast. So take with a grain of salt any kind of short run projections. We know week by week things have changed, but the big narratives in the housing sector remain, which is we're underbuilt, particularly in some of the fast growing areas. That means more land development is going to be needed. Builders and remodelers are looking for additional financing sources to get capital into the sector, and the skilled labor shortage remains a limiting factor on how quickly the industry can change. So if you're a frustrated home buyer, consider new construction, go consider that fixer upper, think about how much it would cost to invest over time in terms of improvement spending. Those opportunities are out there. And we're real bullish on home ownership over the long run.
Oh, no, that's good to know. Dr. Robert Dietz, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, go to our economics blog. It's Eye on Housing, EYE-on-housing.org. You can subscribe to it by email, and I'm online on Twitter and LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me and the team.
You do your own podcast?
No, we don't. We tend to join others. I'm occasionally on the NAHB podcast that features our CEO and our head of the strategy group. But I love talking to people because I learn from the questions, and we were talking about some issues and before we got started. So that's always good to join folks.
You'd be a great podcast host. We'll just end with that. You'd be a great podcast
I appreciate
host.
that.
You can talk about this for days. I definitely tune in. But thank you for being on the podcast again. And I'm sure we're going to have you on sometime in the future.
Thank you, Sean.
Have a great day.
This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace independent professional judgment. Land Gorilla Inc. makes no representations, warranties, or promises for and disclaims any express or implied warranties related to content. Before acting on any information, you should consider the appropriateness of the information as it pertains to your unique business needs.